January 12th, 2023. A Thursday morning in Calabasas, California. Lisa Marie Presley is in her home, the same house where her son died 2.5 years earlier. When the pain begins, it is abdominal, sudden, and severe enough that it drops her. Paramedics are called. They arrive to find a 54-year-old woman in cardiac arrest on the floor of a house she has not been able to leave and has not been able to live inside, not really, not since the summer of 2020. They perform CPR. They transport her to a hospital. 48 hours ago, she was walking a red carpet at the Golden Globes, smiling beside her 87-year-old mother, celebrating a film about her father. Now she is on a gurney, and the doctors are losing her. She was Elvis Presley's only child, the sole heir to Graceland, to the name, to the mythology that turned a dead rock and roll singer into an American religion. The public had watched her grow up, marry 4 times, grieve in ways they photographed but never understood. What they had not seen, what almost nobody outside the family saw, was the private architecture of damage that had been building since before she was born. This is the story of 3 generations of Presleys: a father who became a legend, a daughter who became his keeper, and a grandson who inherited his face and could not survive the weight of it. It stretches from a military base in Cold War Germany to a burial garden in Memphis, where the dead now outnumber the living. It is the story of what Elvis Presley's love actually cost the people closest to him. But to understand how Elvis Presley's only child ended up in that hospital, how Graceland became a place that buries its own as fast as it memorializes them, you have to go back more than 60 years, to a military base in West Germany, to a party in a private house in Bad Nauheim, and to a girl who had not yet turned 15. The name Presley, by the time this story begins, already belonged to the world. Elvis Aaron Presley was not merely famous. He was a category of American experience, a voice, a body, a set of desires made public and then made permanent. By the late 1950s, he had sold tens of millions of records, starred in Hollywood films, been drafted into the United States Army, and become the single most recognized entertainer on the planet. He was the king, and the title was not a joke. It described the way rooms reorganized themselves when he entered. It described the way people, women, men, managers, relatives, strangers, adjusted their posture, their voices, their expectations to accommodate whatever Elvis wanted in a given moment. He was 24 years old in 1959, stationed at a base in Friedberg, West Germany, and he was already accustomed to a world that bent around him. What the public saw was the uniform and the clean jaw and the patriotic humility of a rock and roll star serving his country. What the public did not see was the appetite. Elvis Presley wanted admiration the way other men want oxygen, constantly, reflexively, and in forms he could control. He wanted people close, but on his terms. He wanted intensity without negotiation. He wanted rooms full of loyalty arranged around his moods. And in the autumn of 1959, at a gathering at his off-base residence in Bad Nauheim, he saw a girl named Priscilla Beaulieu sitting on a couch, and what he saw was possibility. Priscilla was 14. She was the stepdaughter of an Air Force officer stationed nearby. A girl who attended school on the base and wore her hair in a way that other teenagers wore their hair. She was pretty, poised, and young enough that she had not yet developed the self-protective instincts the older women brought into Elvis's orbit. That mattered. Later accounts of the relationship, Priscilla's own memoir tradition, published interviews spanning decades, the historical record examined in depth by journalists and filmmakers, would consistently emphasize that Elvis was drawn not just to Priscilla's beauty, but to her malleability. She was young enough to be shaped. She had not yet become the person she was going to be, and Elvis, whether he understood this consciously or not, was attracted to that incompleteness. He could fill it. There is something about that dynamic worth sitting with for a moment. This was not a scandal at the time, not in the way it would be understood now. The age gap between a 24-year-old global celebrity and a 14-year-old schoolgirl was noted, but not treated as disqualifying. What mattered in the public narrative was the romance, the fairy tale of a rock and roll king falling in love with a beautiful girl in a foreign country. What mattered in the private reality was something else entirely. A pattern of control that would define the Presley household for the next 14 years and leave marks on every generation that followed. Elvis courted Priscilla with intensity and care, and also with the particular attentiveness of a man who understood that her parents would need convincing. He called, he visited, he wrote, He presented himself as respectful, gentlemanly, earnest, all the things a father needs to hear, before he sends his teenage daughter across an ocean and into the orbit of a man 10 years her senior and infinitely more famous than anyone in her family had ever met. The courtship continued after Elvis returned to the United States in 1960, sustained by phone calls and letters across an ocean, and then in 1962 and 1963 by visits to Graceland, the mansion in Memphis, Tennessee that Elvis had purchased in 1957 for just over $100,000, a white-columned former church property on a hill south of the city that was already becoming the physical center of the Presley mythology. In 1963, when Priscilla was 17, a negotiation took place between Elvis and her parents that would decide the shape of her life. She would move to Memphis. She would live not with Elvis directly, as the appearance of propriety mattered, but with his father, Vernon Presley, and his stepmother Dee in a house nearby. She would attend Immaculate Conception Cathedral School, a Catholic girls' school. She would finish her education, and the implicit understanding, the unspoken architecture beneath every polite assurance, was that Elvis intended to marry her. Priscilla moved to Memphis and entered a world that operated according to rules she had not written and could not easily question. Elvis chose her clothes. He influenced her hair, her makeup, the way she presented herself. The heavy black liner and the towering dark bouffant that would become her signature look were not expressions of Priscilla's taste, but of his. He wanted a particular kind of beauty, sculpted and dramatic and unmistakably marked as belonging to him, and Priscilla became that beauty. She was 17, then 18, then 19, growing up inside a house where the most powerful person in every room was also the person who had decided what she would look like when she entered it. You have to understand what Graceland was. It was not simply a large house with famous occupants. It was a private kingdom with its own gravitational rules. Elvis kept late hours, sometimes staying awake until dawn watching movies in his private screening room, sometimes riding horses on the property at midnight, sleeping deep into the afternoon while the household waited for him to surface. The staff moved according to his rhythms. Friends and associates, the group that would later be called the Memphis Mafia, occupied the house and the grounds on his invitation and at his pleasure. They ate when Elvis ate. They watched movies when Elvis wanted to watch movies. They went to the fairgrounds or the go-kart track or the gun range when Elvis decided the night required it. Priscilla was the most important woman in this world, but her importance was defined entirely by her relationship to the man at its center. She had no independent career, no separate social life, no identity that existed outside his orbit. The house was beautiful and full and alive, and it was also a closed system in which one person set every term and everyone else arranged themselves accordingly. They married on May 1st, 1967, in Las Vegas in a ceremony that was both intimate and engineered for maximum public effect. The setting was the Aladdin Hotel. The guest list was small. Family, a handful of members from Elvis's inner circle, his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, hovering at the edges with the particular energy of a man who understood that this wedding was also a press event. The ceremony itself lasted 8 minutes. Priscilla was 21. Elvis was 32. She wore a beaded chiffon gown of her own design with a 3-foot veil. Her dark hair swept high, her face immaculate, the image Elvis had spent 4 years perfecting, now walking toward him in white. He wore a black brocade tuxedo and a face that in the photographs registered something between triumph and relief. After the ceremony, there was a brief reception, a breakfast for about 100 guests in the hotel's banquet room, and then the press conference. The couple sat together at a table, Priscilla's hand in Elvis's, answering questions as flashbulbs erupted in staccato bursts. She smiled. He smiled. Every image from that morning communicated the same message. The fairy tale was real. The king had his queen. The story that had started in a house in Bad Nauheim with a 14-year-old girl was reaching its appointed conclusion, and the American public received it gratefully because it confirmed something they wanted to believe about fame and love and destiny. Exactly 9 months later, on February 1st, 1968, Lisa Marie Presley was born at Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis. The timing was almost theatrical. The child arrived as if on cue, as if the Presley mythology had a script supervisor ensuring that every act followed the last with maximum narrative efficiency. Lisa Marie was Elvis and Priscilla's only child. She would remain their only child. And from the moment she entered the world, she was not merely a baby. She was a vessel, a continuation, the single biological thread connecting the king of rock and roll to whatever came next. The cameras were waiting at the hospital. The mythology was already writing itself around an infant who had not yet opened her eyes. For the first years of Lisa Marie's life, the family portrait held Elvis and Priscilla and the baby at Graceland. Photographs of the three of them, Elvis cradling his daughter, Priscilla beside him, the white columns of the house rising behind them, circulated as proof that the fairy tale was real and ongoing. The public saw consolidation, fame, beauty, wealth, a child, a dynasty taking root in Memphis soil. What the public did not see was the growing distance inside the rooms where those photographs were taken. Elvis was frequently away, filming, touring, performing extended residencies in Las Vegas that kept him out of Memphis for weeks and sometimes months at a time. When he was home, his moods governed every room. He was generous and warm in stretches, capable of enormous tenderness with Lisa Marie, capable of the kind of father-daughter moments that anyone watching would have called beautiful. But he was also increasingly dependent on prescription medications, amphetamines, barbiturates, sedatives, the pharmacological architecture of a man who could not regulate his own body without chemical assistance. His weight fluctuated. His sleep schedule was nocturnal and erratic. His attention wandered toward other women with a regularity that made fidelity feel like a concept he admired in principle, but did not practice. And Priscilla, who had spent her entire adult life inside this man's orbit, was beginning to understand that the arrangement she had entered at 14 was not a marriage of equals. It was a set of conditions she had been given no say in designing, and the walls of those conditions were closing in. The household from the inside was a study in contradiction. There was real love. Elvis's devotion to Lisa Marie was genuine and visible, and Priscilla's loyalty to the family unit was more than performance. But there was also a structural imbalance so deep it touched everything. Elvis had built the world, Priscilla inhabited it, and their daughter was absorbing both realities at once: the warmth of a father who adored her, and the instability of a household that belonged to his moods, his absences, his chemical dependencies, and his need to remain the center of every room even when he was barely in the room at all. For Lisa Marie, the emotional architecture of early childhood was simple and devastating. Her father was the largest presence in any space he occupied, and also the most unreliable. He was enormous when he was there. Charismatic, tender, the gravitational center of everything. And then he was gone, and the house went on without him according to rhythms he had established. When he was present and in a good mood, Graceland came alive. He would take Lisa Marie on golf cart rides around the property. He would sit with her in the kitchen while the cook made whatever he was craving at 2 a.m. He would let her sit beside him in the screening room while old movies played, her small body against his, the house warm and humming with the particular energy of a household built around one man's pleasure. Those moments were real. They were not manufactured for cameras or invented in retrospect. Elvis loved his daughter with a purity and a directness that nothing else in his life seemed to match. But the other version of Graceland was also real. The version in which Elvis had been in his bedroom for 18 hours and the staff spoke in lowered voices, the version in which he emerged at odd hours looking puffy and distant, the version in which the pills that lined his nightstand were the true household authority, and everyone, including a small child, adjusted their behavior to accommodate whatever chemical state the king was in on a given evening. Lisa Marie was learning, before she had language to name what she was learning, that love and absence could arrive in the same person. That devotion and disappearance were not opposites but partners, that the most important man in her world was also the person whose presence she could never count on. That lesson, absorbed in the body, not the mind, before the age of 5, would shape every relationship Lisa Marie attempted for the rest of her life. But that is getting ahead of the story. What matters now is what it felt like to be inside that house, in that family, when the first real crack appeared. By 1971, Priscilla had begun an affair. The man was Mike Stone, a karate instructor she had met through Elvis's own social circle. A detail that carries its own quiet cruelty, because even Priscilla's rebellion was routed through the world Elvis had constructed around her. The affair was not casual. It was the first act of autonomous desire Priscilla had exercised since she was 14 years old, the first time she had chosen someone without Elvis's permission or participation, the first crack in a structure that had held for more than a decade. And it was the thing that finally broke the arrangement open. In February 1972, Priscilla told Elvis she was leaving. She was 26 years old. She had spent nearly half her life inside his orbit, first as a girl being shaped in a foreign country, then as a wife being displayed in a mansion in Memphis, and now as a woman who had reached the point where the cost of staying exceeded the cost of going. She wanted something that the marriage, as it was structured, could not give her. the right to exist as a person with her own desires, her own direction, her own interior life that did not require Elvis's permission to unfold. Elvis did not take it well. By several accounts, his response moved through rage, grief, and a possessive desperation that confirmed everything the relationship had always been. He wanted her, but he wanted her on terms that left no room for her to become a separate human being. And when she insisted on leaving anyway, the machinery of the household began to come apart. The separation was formalized. The divorce was finalized on October 9th, 1973, in Santa Monica, California. They appeared in court together, and when they left the building, they held hands, a gesture that was immediately and widely photographed. In the image, Priscilla is wearing sunglasses. Elvis is beside her, larger and softer than the man who had married her 6 years earlier. Their hands are clasped in a way that reads, depending on how you want to see it, as tenderness or theater. The press covered the photograph as proof that the Presleys were different from other divorcing couples, that even their separation was romantic, that grace attended them in failure as it had in success. That photograph was a performance, not because there was no affection. By most accounts, genuine tenderness remained between them, complicated and unresolved, carrying the weight of everything they had shared since she was 14, and he was the most famous man in a room full of soldiers, but because it concealed the depth of what had actually collapsed. The household was over. The arrangement in which Priscilla had been wife, image, companion, and creation was finished. The fairy tale that had started in Bad Nauheim with a teenager and a celebrity had ended in a California courthouse, and the person who would absorb the full emotional weight of that collapse was not the man or the woman who had made the choices. It was their daughter. Lisa Marie was 4 years old, and the only family she had ever known had just been divided into 2 addresses, 2 schedules, 2 versions of reality, between which she would spend the rest of her childhood moving. She became, from that autumn onward, a child of 2 worlds. She moved between her mother's emerging new life. Priscilla was building a career, establishing independence, beginning the long process of becoming the self-possessed woman the public would later admire, and her father's increasingly unstable one. Elvis was not rebuilding. He was deteriorating. The prescription drug dependency that had been a private concern during the marriage was becoming, in its aftermath, a visible and accelerating crisis. His performances in Las Vegas, once the most electrifying act in American entertainment, grew erratic. Some nights he could still command a room with the old authority, and other nights he slurred his words, forgot lyrics, moved through the show as if his body were somewhere his mind had already left. His weight fluctuated dramatically. The Memphis mafia thinned as friends drifted away or were pushed out. The house itself seemed to contract around him. Graceland in its heyday had been a place of energy and movement, rooms full of people and noise and the crackling unpredictability of being near someone who lived at the center of the world. By the mid-70s, the energy was gone. What remained was quieter and stranger. A famous man in a large house with a shrinking circle of people around him, the television running at all hours, the pharmacy on his nightstand, replenished by doctors who either did not see or did not want to see what was happening. Lisa Marie visited her father in this world. She was 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, walking into a house where the most famous man in America was coming apart, and the people around him either could not or would not stop it. She saw him bloated and sedated. She saw him manic and generous. She saw the man who lifted her onto his lap with genuine love, and the man who sometimes could not stay awake long enough to finish a sentence. The tenderness was real. His love for his daughter was one of the few things about Elvis that even his harshest critics do not dispute. But so was the chaos, and a child does not distinguish between those things. A child takes them both in as one experience, one father, one version of what love is. She was learning that the people you love most are also the people most capable of disappearing while they are still in the room. She was 8 years old, and the lesson was being written into her with the steady, irrevocable pressure of daily life. And here is the inheritance that is not money. It is not the trust fund that would eventually be valued in the tens of millions of dollars. It is not the publishing rights or the merchandising empire or the deed to a white-columned mansion in Memphis. It is the experience of watching someone you love become unreachable, while the entire world continues to worship them. It is the particular loneliness of being the daughter of a man who belongs to everyone and is available to no one. What Lisa Marie would do with that inheritance, the emotional one, the one no lawyer could administer and no trust could contain, would play out across the next 5 decades of her life. She would try, more than once, to build something different. In 1988, at 20, she married a musician named Danny Keough, a quiet man, unflashy, the kind of presence that does not reorganize rooms when it enters them. Danny was the opposite of Elvis in almost every measurable way: modest, low-key, comfortable with ordinariness. Their daughter Riley was born in 1989. Their son Benjamin was born in 1992. And for a stretch of years, the story seemed to offer a different possibility: a young mother building a family grounded not in mythology but in something closer to normal life. Riley would later describe a childhood split between two very different realities. With her mother, there was Graceland, celebrity, the weight of the Presley name pressing down on every room. With her father, Danny, there was a different world entirely. Apartments with mattresses on the floor, eccentric warmth, a life without staff or mythology or the constant hum of public scrutiny. That contrast matters for what comes later, because it shows that another version of family was available to these children, that the Presley gravity was not the only force at work. But Benjamin, born in 1992, Elvis's only grandson, would inherit something more specific and more dangerous than a famous last name. He inherited a face. From childhood, people who met Benjamin remarked on how strongly he resembled his grandfather. The same jaw, the same eyes, the same quality of stillness that could tip, depending on the angle, into either charisma or melancholy. The public knew Benjamin mostly through that resemblance. They knew almost nothing about who he actually was. He would grow up quieter than his sister, more private, less willing or less able to convert the family's exposure into a career. And the gap between what the world projected onto him and what was actually happening inside him would, decades later, become the central tragedy of this story. But that was all still to come. In 1973, none of it had happened yet. All that had happened was a divorce, a household split in two, and a little girl learning to live between a mother who was trying to become herself and a father who was trying to disappear into a body full of pills. The official family was over. The real damage had barely started. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There is so much more to this family that the public never saw, and we're just getting started. On August 16th, 1977, at Graceland, in the bathroom adjoining his master bedroom on the second floor, Elvis Aaron Presley's heart stopped. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, though the role of the prescription drugs in his system, 14 different substances according to the toxicology, was a matter of public dispute for years afterward. What was not in dispute was the state of the man who died. He was overweight, he was chemically saturated, he was alone in the bathroom when he collapsed, and by the time he was found, face down on the carpet, his body already cooling, the distance between the young soldier who had charmed a 14-year-old girl in Germany and the bloated figure on the floor was so vast that it amounted to a different life entirely. Lisa Marie was 9 years old. She was at Graceland that day. The details of what she saw, what she heard, what she understood in the hours after her father's body was discovered have never been fully established in a single authoritative account. But what is known is that she was present, she was a child, and the man who had been the center of her emotional universe, unreliable, adoring, medicated, enormous, tender, disappearing, was now gone in a way that permitted no further visits, no more golf cart rides around the property, no more late-night kitchen trips while the rest of the world slept. The father was finished. The man whose moods had governed the temperature of every room in that house would never set foot in it again. And for a 9-year-old girl who had already spent 4 years navigating the wreckage of her parents' divorce, shuttling between a mother building a new life and a father dissolving inside an old one, the death did not arrive as a single blow. It arrived as the final collapse of a structure that had been buckling since before she could remember. What replaced the father was something much larger and much less human: the legend. Elvis Presley did not simply die. He ascended. His death triggered an outpouring of public grief so enormous that it reshaped the landscape of American celebrity mourning for decades to come. 80,000 people descended on Memphis in the days after his death. The funeral procession stretched for miles. Flowers and letters and photographs accumulated at the gates of Graceland in drifts that had to be cleared by the staff. The house became almost immediately a site of pilgrimage. Not just a property where a famous man had lived and died, but a shrine, a destination, a place where strangers came to weep for someone they had never met and would never stop missing. For a 9-year-old girl who had lost her father, that public grief was both a validation and a theft. The world confirmed that her loss was real, that Elvis mattered, that the man she had loved was worthy of the enormous feelings she carried for him. But the world also took him. He was no longer her father in any way that belonged to her alone. He was everyone's Elvis, printed on t-shirts, played on jukeboxes, impersonated by strangers in white jumpsuits, memorialized on velvet paintings in gas stations and living rooms across the country. And the house where she had been a child, where the room still held the smell and the furniture and the particular silence of a place that a specific man had inhabited, was about to become something she would have to share with the entire country. The financial reality accelerated the transformation. After Elvis's death, the estate passed to Lisa Marie through a trust, overseen initially by her grandfather Vernon, and after Vernon's death in 1979, by Priscilla and other appointed trustees. By the early 1980s, the estate was hemorrhaging money, taxes, debts, maintenance on a property that was expensive to keep and had no income stream attached to it. Priscilla made the decision that would define the Presley legacy for the next 4 decades. On June 7th, 1982, Graceland opened to the public as a paid tourist attraction. The house where Lisa Marie had been a child became a museum. The rooms where Elvis had lived and medicated and loved his daughter and fallen apart were roped off and narrated by tour guides. Visitors walked through and took photographs and bought souvenirs in the gift shop, and the estate's financial bleeding stopped. By any business measure, the decision was a success. It saved Graceland. It preserved the Presley name as a commercial enterprise, and it meant that Lisa Marie's childhood home would never again be simply a home. It was a monument now. It belonged to the dead. Lisa Marie turned 25 in 1993, and the original trust, holding Elvis's estate, dissolved, passing its assets to her directly. She formed a new trust to continue managing the business, the merchandising, the licensing, the ongoing operation of Graceland as an attraction that drew hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. The inheritance was enormous, and it was also a job. She did not merely receive her father's money. She became responsible for maintaining what was left of him, the brand, the property, the public-facing apparatus of memory that kept Elvis commercially alive. She was 25 years old, and she was being asked to steward a myth before she had finished metabolizing what it meant to be his child. By this point, Lisa Marie had already attempted to build a different kind of life. Her marriage to Benjamin Keough in 1988 had given her 2 children, Riley, born in 1989, and Benjamin, born in 1992, and a household that felt, at least for a time, like a departure from the Presley pattern. Danny was quiet where Elvis had been volcanic. He was present where Elvis had been absent. He did not need rooms to rearrange themselves around his moods. The marriage offered something Lisa Marie had never experienced in her own childhood. A father who showed up, reliably, without the mediation of fame or chemicals or an entourage. But the marriage did not hold. Lisa Marie and Danny divorced in 1994, and the reasons, like the reasons behind most marriages that end, were more complicated than any single narrative can capture. What the documentary can say with confidence is that the pattern reasserted itself. Lisa Marie did not move toward stability after Danny. She moved toward spectacle. In 1994, 20 days after her divorce from Danny was finalized, she married Michael Jackson. The union was met with global incredulity and fascination. The daughter of the king of rock and roll and the self-proclaimed king of pop, and 2 of the most famous surnames in American entertainment history, joined in a ceremony at the Casa de Campo resort in the Dominican Republic. The public could not decide whether to treat it as romance or performance, as genuine love or mutual brand management. The truth was probably more human and more confused than either interpretation allowed. Lisa Marie, by her own later accounts, was genuinely drawn to Jackson, drawn to his intensity, his isolation, his particular kind of damage, which rhymed with her own in ways she recognized even if she could not fully articulate them. He was another man who lived inside a mythology so total that normal human relationships became almost impossible. He was another man who had been famous since childhood, who did not know how to exist without an audience, who built private worlds, Neverland, with its amusement park rides and its zoo animals, and its determined, almost frantic construction of a childhood that had never actually occurred, to insulate himself from a reality he found unbearable. Lisa Marie had not stepped outside the logic of American myth. She had married deeper into it. She had chosen, again, a man whose fame was so consuming that private life dissolved inside it, another household organized around a singular, world-famous figure whose relationship to ordinary existence was non-existent. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. They divorced in January 1996, and Lisa Marie would later describe the relationship with a mixture of tenderness and bewilderment that suggested she had understood something real about Jackson and had been unable to save either him or herself from the forces that made the marriage impossible. Then came Nicolas Cage. They married in 2002 in Hawaii, and the marriage lasted 108 days before Cage filed for divorce. Then came Michael Lockwood in 2006, a musician less globally famous than her previous husbands, but whose marriage to Lisa Marie would prove the most legally contentious and personally damaging of them all. They had twin daughters, Harper and Finley, born in October 2008, and the family seemed briefly to offer yet another possibility of domestic reset. But the marriage deteriorated. Lisa Marie filed for divorce in 2016, initiating a custody battle over the twins that would drag on for years and become, through its legal filings and financial disclosures, a public record of domestic unhappiness that no amount of Presley money could contain. 4 marriages, 4 attempts to build something that worked differently from the household she had grown up in, something that might break the pattern her father had established and her childhood had encoded into her nervous system. And each time, the gravitational pull of the original pattern. Intensity followed by instability, devotion followed by distance, the search for a man large enough to fill the space her father had left, reasserted itself. That is not a judgment. It is a description of what the documented record shows. Lisa Marie Presley spent her adult life trying to construct families, and the families kept coming apart, and the children born into those families kept absorbing the consequences. Riley and Benjamin grew up inside this instability, and they grew up differently. Riley, the older child, seemed to metabolize the family's exposure by moving toward it. She became an actress and a model, and eventually a filmmaker, building a public career that gave her a way to engage with fame on her own terms rather than simply inheriting it as a condition. She was articulate about her childhood in interviews, the split between her mother's world of Graceland and celebrity and her father Danny's world of mattresses on the floor and unstructured warmth. She described a childhood that was privileged and chaotic in roughly equal measure, and she described it with a clarity that suggested she had found a way to see the whole picture without being crushed by it. Benjamin did not find that way. He was quieter than his sister, more private, less inclined or less able to convert the Presley inheritance into a public identity that served him rather than consumed him. What the world knew about Benjamin Keough was almost entirely reducible to one fact. He looked like Elvis. The resemblance was uncanny. The same jawline, the same dark coloring, the same quality of physical beauty that could tip, depending on the photograph, from warmth into something more guarded and more remote. People who met him remarked on it with the particular eagerness of people who have seen a ghost. Strangers on the street remarked on it. The press remarked on it whenever they had occasion to photograph him, which was not often. Because Benjamin avoided the camera with a consistency that, in a family defined by public exposure, felt almost like rebellion. He was the grandson who looked exactly like the grandfather, and the world wanted to celebrate that resemblance, and Benjamin seemed to want nothing to do with any of it. But resemblance is not identity, and the gap between what the world projected onto Benjamin and what was actually happening inside him was widening year by year. He did not launch a career. He did not seek the spotlight. He did not build the kind of public scaffolding that might have given him a way to carry the weight of the name. He moved through the world with the face of the most famous man in American music history and without any visible structure, professional, creative, or otherwise, to help him metabolize what that meant. And inside the family, the pressures were not easing. They were compounding. His mother was struggling with addiction, an opioid dependency that, by her own account in the posthumous memoir later completed by Riley, had escalated to devastating proportions after the birth of the twins in 2008. The addiction had not come from nowhere. It had roots in the same soil that had produced Elvis's pharmaceutical dependency. The same family, the same pattern of using chemicals to manage pain that could not be addressed any other way. The same gap between public performance and private suffering. At the height of her dependency, Lisa Marie described taking as many as 80 pills a day. That number is difficult to absorb. It suggests not recreational use, but a body so chemically restructured that ordinary consciousness had become unbearable. She was a mother of 4 children, the youngest of whom were toddlers. She was the steward of an estate worth tens of millions of dollars. She was carrying the weight of a dead father who had never stopped being famous and a name that meant something to every person she met. And she was taking 80 pills a day because the alternative, being fully soberly present inside her own life, was a place she could not stay. The family's world was getting smaller. The options were narrowing. Lisa Marie had tried sobriety and relapsed and tried again, and the cycle of recovery and collapse was itself a kind of inheritance. Her father had been unable to stop, and she was finding that the inability ran in the blood or in the pattern or in whatever combination of biology and environment produces a person who cannot stay in their own skin without chemical mediation. The estate, the brand, the house in Memphis, the ongoing public appetite for all things Elvis, these kept running, kept generating revenue, kept demanding management, kept requiring someone in the family to serve as the living face of a dead man's legacy. And the children kept growing up inside all of it, absorbing what the adults could not resolve. By the summer of 2020, Benjamin Keough was 27 years old. He was living in Calabasas, California, at a home connected to his mother's. The world outside was in the grip of a pandemic. Streets emptied, gatherings canceled, the ordinary social scaffolding of daily life stripped away. For people already struggling with isolation, with depression, with the weight of private pain that had no adequate outlet, the pandemic's enforced solitude was not neutral. It was pressure applied to fracture lines that were already there. It was silence poured into rooms that were already too quiet. What happened inside Benjamin's days in the weeks and months before July 2020 is not fully established in the public record. He did not give interviews. He did not post extensively on social media. He did not leave behind the kind of public trail that allows a documentary to reconstruct, beat by beat, the interior experience of a young man approaching the worst moment of his life. What the record does establish is this: Benjamin was struggling. He was carrying the face of a grandfather he had never met, the name of a family that could not stop being famous, the experience of a childhood divided between worlds that did not cohere, and whatever private pain he held that no public source has the right to name with certainty. He was 27, the same age that has, in the mythology of popular music, become a shorthand for brilliant lives cut short. Whether Benjamin knew that, whether it mattered to him, whether the number meant anything at all inside the specificity of his own suffering, is something no documentary can answer. What the documentary can do is mark the date. On July 12th, 2020, a Sunday, Benjamin Keough took his own life at the family's home in Calabasas, California. He was 27 years old. The details that have been publicly confirmed are spare, and the script should honor that sparseness rather than fill the silence with invention. A self-inflicted gunshot wound. The family home. A summer Sunday during a global pandemic, when the streets outside were quiet and the distance between people had become a condition of daily existence rather than a choice. The emergency response that followed, and then the phone calls. The ones that go out from a house where someone has just died. The ones that shatter the ordinary mourning of every person who answers. The ones that divide time into before and after with the efficiency of a knife. There is a particular cruelty in a death that occurs inside a family home. The rooms do not change. The furniture does not rearrange itself. The coffee cups from that morning are still on the counter. The ordinary objects of a household go on, existing in a space that has been permanently altered by what happened inside it. And the people who live there must decide, in the hours and days and weeks that follow, whether they can ever walk through those rooms again without hearing the sound that changed everything. Lisa Marie was, by every account that followed, destroyed. Her representative released a statement saying she was entirely heartbroken, inconsolable, and beyond devastated, and that she was trying to stay strong for her 3 surviving daughters, Riley and the twins, Harper and Finley, who were 11 years old. The language of the statement was formal and controlled, the way public statements always are, when the private reality behind them is too enormous for language to contain. Priscilla, Elvis's ex-wife, Benjamin's grandmother, a woman who had watched the Presley family absorb loss after loss across 5 decades, released her own statement. She described Benjamin as the love of Lisa Marie's life. That phrase, in the love of her life, applied by a mother to describe her daughter's relationship with her own son, carries a weight that is difficult to hold without looking away. It means that Priscilla understood, perhaps before anyone else did, that this loss was not one Lisa Marie would recover from. Not fully. not in the way that recovery implies a return to something resembling the life that existed before the phone rang. Riley's grief was quieter in the public record, but no less total. She had lost her younger brother, the boy who had grown up beside her through the split world childhood, who shared her parents and her bloodline and the particular strangeness of being Elvis Presley's grandchild in a world that would not stop reminding you of it. She had watched him carry the resemblance that the public found so endlessly fascinating and that may have felt from the inside like wearing someone else's face through a life that was supposed to be your own. And now he was gone at 27 in a house in Calabasas during a summer when the whole world was already grieving and no one could gather properly to mourn. The burial decision was made, and it was the decision that locks the story's three-generation structure into place, with a finality that no amount of time can undo. Benjamin Keough was laid to rest in the meditation garden at Graceland in Memphis, Tennessee, the same small garden where Elvis Aaron Presley had been buried since 1977, where Vernon Presley lay beside his son, where the family's dead had been accumulating in the same patch of ground for more than 4 decades. The grandson returned to the property built by the grandfather. The young man who had carried Elvis's face through a life he never asked for was placed in the earth beside the man whose face it was. And Graceland, which had been a home and then a shrine and then a business and then a tourist destination that charged admission to walk past the graves, added another name to the garden. The public knew Benjamin mostly through photographs and through his resemblance to Elvis. They mourned a symbol. The family mourned a person, a son, a brother, a grandson, a young man who had liked music and avoided cameras and lived most of his 27 years outside the spotlight that consumed everyone else who carried his last name. That gap between public grief and private grief was the same gap that had defined this family since 1977, since the day Elvis died and the world's mourning swallowed a little girl's loss whole. It was happening again. The family's pain was becoming public property again, and the people inside that pain had to carry it while the world watched again. Lisa Marie Presley had lost her father at 9. She had spent the next 43 years living inside the mythology he left behind, managing it, inheriting it, trying to escape it, marrying into other mythologies, struggling with addiction, raising children in the shadow of a house that would not stop being famous. And now she had lost her son. The boy she had brought into the world in 1992 was buried next to the man who had left the world in 1977, and the distance between those two graves in the meditation garden was only a few feet. And the distance between those two deaths was 43 years. And the distance between what the public saw when they visited Graceland and what the family felt when they stood in that garden was the distance this entire story has been trying to measure. Priscilla would later say, publicly and without equivocation, that after Benjamin's death, Lisa Marie did not want to be here anymore. That statement carries the weight of a mother watching her own daughter lose the will to continue living. It does not explain what happened next, but it tells you the emotional truth of the 2.5 years that remained. The family had lost another young man to a house that kept collecting its dead, and this time the mother might not survive the loss. What followed was not recovery. It was endurance without direction, a woman moving through the remaining architecture of her life, because her other children needed her to stay upright, not because she believed the architecture could hold. Lisa Marie Presley spent the 2.5 years after Benjamin's death in a state that the people closest to her would later describe, in various formulations, as devastation from which she never emerged. She continued to function, if function is the right word for the performance of daily survival, by a person whose central reason for continuing has been removed. She attended to the twins, Harper and Finley, who were 11 when their half-brother died and who needed their mother to be present in the most basic, daily, unglamorous ways: meals, school logistics, bedtimes, the 1,000 small decisions that constitute motherhood when motherhood is the only thing keeping you tethered to the living. She continued, at least nominally, to oversee the Presley estate, the business apparatus that kept Graceland operating, the licensing and merchandising and tourism infrastructure that depended on the family name continuing to mean something in the marketplace. She did interviews. She appeared at events when the occasion demanded it. She did the things that a person does when the world expects them to keep existing inside a life they no longer recognize as their own. But Priscilla's later statement, that Lisa Marie did not want to be here anymore after Benjamin, was not rhetoric or metaphor. It was a clinical description of an emotional condition. The grief was not the kind that softens with months and season and eventually permits a person to re-enter their life with something approaching acceptance. It was the kind that sits down inside you and does not leave, the kind that reorganizes every room you walk into so that the absent person is the first thing you feel when you cross the threshold. Lisa Marie had lost a child who, by her own mother's public account, was the love of her life. She had lost him to suicide, a death that carries its own particular weight of guilt and helplessness and unanswerable questions, the weight that belongs to every parent who survives a child's self-inflicted death, the relentless interior interrogation of whether something could have been said, something noticed, something done differently at some point across 27 years that might have altered the final moment. And she had lost him to Graceland because that is where he was buried, which meant that the place where her father's death had been transformed into an industry was now also the place where her son's body lay, beneath the grass, and every visit to that garden required her to stand on a few square feet of ground that held 3 generations of Presley grief stacked in the earth like geological layers of the same catastrophe. During this period, Lisa Marie began working on a memoir. The project was, by its nature, an act of excavation, a deliberate, painful return to the material of her own life, to the childhood at Graceland, to the marriages that had failed, to the addiction that had nearly killed her, to the grief that was still killing her in slower and less visible ways. She recorded herself speaking into a device, narrating the story in her own voice, sometimes haltingly, sometimes with a fluency that suggested these were things she had been rehearsing in her mind for years without ever saying them aloud. The recordings would later become the raw material from which the published book was assembled, but at the time of their making, they were something more private than a manuscript. They were a woman talking to herself about what had happened to her, trying to organize 54 years of experience into a shape that might be bearable, trying to find the language for things that the Presley family had never had adequate language for. The cost of the name, the weight of the dead father, the loneliness of being simultaneously the most protected and the most exposed person in every room. She was trying to tell the truth. Whether the telling was therapeutic or whether it was another form of the same exposure that had defined her entire life, the Presley compulsion, passed from generation to generation to turn private pain into public artifact, is a question the documentary can raise without pretending to answer. What matters is that she was doing it. She was sitting with the full inventory of her own story and attempting to shape it into something that might outlast the tabloid version, the Wikipedia version, the version in which she was nothing but Elvis's daughter, and then a series of famous marriages, and then a death. One of the details that emerged from the memoir after its publication was among the most devastating in the entire Presley record, and it requires care in the handling because its power lies in its specificity, not in commentary. After Benjamin's death in July 2020, Lisa Marie kept his body at her home on dry ice for 2 months. She could not let him go. The funeral arrangements, the logistics of burial at Graceland, the finality that comes with surrendering a body to the earth, she could not do it. Not yet. Not while the reality of his absence was still so raw that it felt less like grief and more like an amputation that had not been given anesthesia. She kept him in the house. She kept him close. During that period, she arranged for a tattoo artist to come to the home so that she and Riley could get matching tattoos, copies of a tattoo Benjamin had worn on his hand, his own mark now reproduced on the skin of his mother and his sister. The tattoo artist worked in proximity to Benjamin's preserved body. The living marked themselves with the dead boy's image, while the dead boy lay nearby, held in suspension between the life he had left and the burial ground that waited for him in Memphis. That detail is not sensationalism. It is the record of a grief so total that it overrode every norm, every practical consideration, every instinct toward closure that the culture encourages in the bereaved. Lisa Marie was not performing. She was drowning in a loss that would not let her surface. And the form she found for it, the keeping the body, marking her skin, recording her voice, were not symptoms of dysfunction. They were the acts of a woman trying to hold on to something that had already gone. On January 10th, 2023, 2.5 years after Benjamin's death, Lisa Marie Presley attended the Golden Globe Awards ceremony at the Beverly Hilton Hotel in Beverly Hills. She was there because Baz Luhrmann's film Elvis, starring Austin Butler in the title role, had been nominated, and because the Presley family's presence at the ceremony was both personally significant and publicly expected. The film had been a cultural event, a lavish, kinetic retelling of Elvis's life that had grossed hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide and introduced the Presley mythology to a generation that had never seen him perform. Lisa Marie had been publicly supportive of the film. She had praised Butler's performance, and so she walked the red carpet that Tuesday evening in Beverly Hills, posing for photographs alongside Priscilla, who was 87, and alongside the producers and cast members who had spent 2 years building a cinematic version of the man whose actual life had shaped every day of Lisa Marie's existence. In the photographs from that evening, Lisa Marie was 54 years old and she looked thinner than the public remembered. Her face was drawn in a way that registered differently depending on what the viewer already knew. Glamorous if you saw only the red carpet dress and the camera flashes, haunted if you knew what the previous 2.5 years had cost her. She smiled. She stood beside her mother. She participated in the ritual of public celebration that accompanies films about famous people, a ritual that requires the living relatives to appear pleased that their family's most private wounds have been rendered in surround sound for a paying audience. Whether she was pleased, whether the film gave her comfort or reopened something, whether standing in that room listening to applause for a performance of her father felt like tribute or like theft, those are questions the evening did not answer and that Lisa Marie would never have the chance to address. That was a Tuesday evening. 48 hours later, Lisa Marie Presley was dead. On January 12th, 2023, a Thursday, at her home in Calabasas, California, Lisa Marie Presley experienced severe abdominal pain. The pain was sudden and escalating, the kind of pain that announces itself as an emergency before anyone has time to assess what is happening. She went into cardiac arrest. Paramedics were called to the house, the same Calabasas property where, 2.5 years earlier, her son had died in a room she still lived among. And they worked to stabilize her, performing CPR, fighting to keep her heart beating in a body that was shutting down from the inside. She was transported to a hospital. Medical teams continued resuscitation efforts for hours. The family was notified. Priscilla came. Riley came. The people who had spent their lives inside the Presley story gathered in the hospital and waited. The way families wait when the doctors have not yet used a word that changes everything, but the silence between updates has grown long enough to carry its own meaning. And then the waiting ended the way it ends when the body has made its decision, and no amount of intervention can reverse it. Lisa Marie Presley died on January 12th, 2023. She was 54 years old. She had been alive for 48 hours after walking a red carpet in Beverly Hills, celebrating a film about her father, and the brutal proximity of those two events, the public glamour and the private collapse, the applause for a cinematic Elvis and the ambulance for his real daughter, the mythology still generating revenue and award season attention, while the woman at its living center lay dying, was the entire Presley story compressed into a single week. The gap between the public version and the private reality, the gap that this family had been falling through for 60 years, had never been narrower or more cruel. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner ruled the death natural. The cause was small bowel obstruction, a complication of adhesive scar tissue from a prior bariatric surgery she had undergone years earlier. The mechanism was medical, not mythological. There was no drug involvement in the immediate cause of death. There was no foul play. Her body had failed in a way that was clinically explicable and, to the people who loved her, emotionally incomprehensible, because the family's own public testimony made clear that the 2.5 years between Benjamin's death and her own had been defined by a grief so consuming that the clinical explanation felt, to those closest to the situation, almost beside the point. The body gave out. The spirit, by Priscilla's account, had wanted to give out since July of 2020. Lisa Marie was buried at Graceland in the meditation garden, beside her father and beside her son. The garden, already holding Elvis since 1977, already holding Benjamin since the summer of 2020 somewhere, received another member of the family, and the small plot of ground that had once been a quiet space behind a wealthy man's house now held 3 generations of Presleys, who had each in their own way been unable to escape the gravity of the name they shared. Grandfather, daughter, grandson, now resting within feet of each other in a garden that tourists walk past every day of the year, paying between $40 and $75 to stand in the presence of a grief that belongs to people they will never meet. The house that Elvis bought in 1957 for just over $100,000 had become the final address for 3 generations of Presleys who had died too young or too broken or both. And the thing that no visitor standing in that garden can fully absorb is that the graves are not just historical, they are recent. Benjamin was buried in 2020, Lisa Marie in 2023. The ground is still settling. In the months that followed Lisa Marie's death, the question of who would carry the Presley legacy forward, was answered with a clarity that the rest of the family's story had never possessed. Riley Keough, Lisa Marie's oldest child, became sole trustee of the Graceland estate. The transition was not without complication. There were legal proceedings, financial complexities, the administrative machinery of an enterprise that generated millions of dollars annually, employed dozens of people, and operated a property that was simultaneously a National Historic Landmark, a functioning tourism business, and the burial ground of Riley's own family. Priscilla, who had managed the estate for decades and whose business acumen had saved Graceland from financial ruin in the early 1980s, was initially involved in the trust discussions. By August 2023, the situation had resolved. Riley was the trustee. She was 34 years old, and she was now the person legally responsible for the house, the brand, the licensing deals, the garden, and the dead. Riley also undertook the task of finishing her mother's memoir. It addressed Elvis not as a legend enshrined in a garden, but as a father whose early death and posthumous deification had shaped every relationship, every marriage, every chemical dependency, and every act of parenting that his daughter had attempted in the 54 years she survived him. And the detail about keeping Benjamin's body on dry ice, the detail that more than any other captured the totality of Lisa Marie's grief, was included not for shock, but for the same reason the rest of the book existed. Because the truth, however difficult, was what Lisa Marie had wanted to leave behind. Riley's contribution to the book was not merely editorial. She was writing herself into the story, placing her own voice alongside her mother's recorded one, creating a document that was simultaneously a daughter completing a mother's unfinished work and a survivor trying to understand the machinery that had consumed her family. She was also, in doing so, performing the same act that Priscilla had performed decades earlier with her own memoir, taking the private reality of life inside the Presley orbit and translating it into a public text, because the public would never stop wanting to know, and because silence had never protected this family from anything. The cultural afterlife of the Presley family continued to expand alongside the memoir, and the timing was not coincidental. In 2023, Sofia Coppola released Priscilla, a film drawn directly from Priscilla Presley's memoir tradition, with Kaylee Spaney as the young Priscilla and Jacob Elordi as Elvis. The film was deliberately quiet where Luhrmann's Elvis had been loud, deliberately intimate where the earlier production had been spectacular. It moved slowly. It stayed close to Priscilla's face, to the confusion in her eyes when she first entered Graceland, to the loneliness that accumulated behind the makeup Elvis had chosen for her, to the moment when she finally understood that the most glamorous house in Memphis was also a prison, whose bars were made of devotion and fame and the impossible expectation that she remain exactly what her husband had designed her to be. Spaney's performance captured something that the earlier mythology had mostly omitted: the cost of being chosen by Elvis Presley, the slow realization that being the most important woman in a great man's world meant having no world of your own. The film arrived in theaters while the family was still burying its dead, while Riley was still assembling the memoir, while Priscilla herself was still giving interviews about the daughter she had lost and the grandson who had preceded her. The Presley story was being rewritten from inside. Each new iteration, each film, each book, each public statement attempting to reclaim some piece of private truth from the enormous public legend that had consumed the family since Elvis first walked onto a stage in Memphis in the 1950s. Priscilla the film and From Here to the Great Unknown, the memoir arrived within months of each other, and between them they offered something that had never quite existed in this form before. The Presley women's version of the story, told in their own voices and on their own terms, no longer mediated solely by the mythology of the man who had started everything. The women had always been the ones left behind. Priscilla left behind by the marriage, Lisa Marie left behind by the death, Riley left behind by both, and now they were the ones doing the telling. Whether the telling would be enough to break the pattern, whether narrating the damage could prevent its repetition, was a question the story could not yet answer. Priscilla Presley is 80 years old now. She lives in Los Angeles. She remains a public-facing figure, still giving interviews, still revisiting the origin story that began when she was a teenager in a house in Germany, and a famous man looked at her across a room. She has spent more of her life as Elvis Presley's ex-wife than she ever spent as his wife, and the role has required her to be, at various times, a businesswoman, a memoirist, an actress, a mother, a grandmother, and a custodian of a story she did not choose, but has never been permitted to leave. She has outlived her ex-husband by nearly 5 decades. She has outlived her daughter. She has outlived her grandson. She is the last living adult who was present at the beginning of the Presley family as the world understands it. The last person who remembers what the house felt like before it was a museum, and what Elvis sounded like when he was not performing for anyone. In recent years, she has returned publicly to the Germany connection, reflecting on the military base and the party and the moment that changed everything. And those interviews carry the particular quality of a person looking back at a fork in the road from a distance of 66 years and still not quite knowing what to make of the path she took. Riley Keough is 36. She acts, she directs, she produces, she runs the Graceland estate with a staid philosophy of preservation rather than expansion. Her goal, she has said publicly, is simply to keep the family home standing, to maintain the grounds, to honor what the place means without turning it into something louder or more commercially aggressive than it already is. She is married. She is a mother herself now. She carries the Presley name and the Keough name and the weight of both, and she is the first person in 3 generations of this family who appears to be building a life that is neither consumed by the mythology nor in flight from it. Whether that balance holds, whether the gravitational pull of the Presley story will eventually pull her into the same orbit that captured everyone before her, is something only time will determine. What can be said now is that she is here, she is working, and she is trying. Harper and Finley Lockwood, Lisa Marie's youngest daughters, are 17. They remain largely shielded from public life, protected by the adults around them from the level of exposure that consumed their mother and their half-brother and their grandfather before them. They are growing up in a family where the dead outnumber the living in the garden of the house that bears their name. Whether they will choose to engage with the Presley legacy or to distance themselves from it, whether the patterns that repeated across 3 generations will find a fourth or finally exhaust themselves, are questions that belong to them and not to this story. Elvis Presley was not only a father who died too soon, he was a father whose death became a system his family had to live inside. The money survived, the brand survived, the house survived. What did not survive, at least not cleanly, was the possibility of an ordinary private life for the people closest to him. Lisa Marie inherited the name, the property, the grief, and the job of carrying him forward. Benjamin inherited a face the world already recognized and a silence he could not break. Riley inherited what was left and is trying to turn inheritance into stewardship instead of repetition. There is no neat moral in that. There is no lesson that makes the losses add up to wisdom. There is just a family in which love and myth kept arriving in the same package, and the people who tried to unwrap one without the other kept cutting themselves on what was inside.